I would say more often than not, power is happening at a more invisible level. And I think how that power might be defined is whose needs and interests and values are built into the relationship, whose needs and goals are taking precedent.
Welcome to the Get Your Marriage On podcast. I'm your host, Dan Purcell, a Christian marriage and intimacy expert and coach. I'm on a mission to help couples have the best sex and most emotionally intimate marriages possible. Our episodes cover topics you've always wondered about and are packed with practical advice designed to help you take your marriage to the next level. Happy New Year, everyone. I'm so glad you're here listening to the Get Your Marriage On podcast. We have some great things planned for 2024. We have some amazing content coming up on our podcast. We have a huge launch of a product that I think you're going to absolutely love in March. We also have a retreat coming up. And of course, don't forget Valentine's Day with our annual Valentine's Day challenge. Now, let's get into this amazing episode with Bonnie Young. Who in your relationship has more of a say in general? Who in your relationship organizes themselves around the other more? Are there any unaddressed resentments that you deal with in your relationship right now? Do some things feel just one-sided in your marriage? Couples that thrive have a shared sense of power in the relationship. Power in this context is defined as, shared power, shared influence. One person can receive the influence from the other. The moment we start creating hierarchies in a relationship, meaning one person is more important than the other, or the general order of things goes like, God, husband, wife, for example. When we create these hierarchies in our relationship, we set ourselves up for power struggles. This often undermines sexual desire and intimacy in the marriage. I work with couples that want to grow their sexual relationship, and that's one of the purposes of this podcast. The reality is you grow the sexual relationship by strengthening the marriage and upgrading the relationship dynamic. One way to quickly improve your sex life is by paying close attention to the power dynamics at play in your relationship, and some of them might be invisible to you or very covert. My guest today is Bonnie Young. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist, licensed in Utah and Washington State. She's also currently working on her PhD. She's super smart, caring, and as you'll get to know, experienced in this topic we're going to talk about today. She's also a mom of 2, almost 3 children, and runs a mental health clinic with almost a dozen therapists working for her in 2 states in her spare time. I also want to take a minute to thank you for listening to the podcast and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. Now, if you leave a review on Apple Podcasts and I read your review on air, email me at support@getyourmarriageon and I will mail you a special prize. So hopefully that gives you an incentive to pause the podcast right now, open your podcast app and leave a review. This is what this one person said. He says, I appreciate the wisdom Dan and his guests share on this podcast. He has had some very knowledgeable and insightful guests, and I've learned a lot. Thank you very much for that review. I want to invite you to come to our upcoming marriage retreat. This is on March 14th through 17th in beautiful, sunny, and warm St. George, Utah. This is an amazing opportunity to draw closer to your spouse and build momentum for your future as a couple. When you attend the retreat, you'll receive expert instruction, personalized coaching. You'll be able to relax in a secluded and intimate setting, enjoy outdoor adventures, and much, much more. This event is limited to only 20 couples, so please don't hesitate. More information, including video testimonials of others that have attended our retreats, are on our website at getyourmarriageon.com and click on Couples Retreat. Bonnie, welcome to the Get Your Marriage On podcast. How are you today?
Doing great, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Great. Do you have an interesting story about how you and your husband met?
Yes. Well, I like to say the simple story that I met him in Mexico City on spring break, but that's
a wild type.
Yeah, sometimes. But that's not completely truthful. We were actually both working in Mexico City in a church-related capacity. So not quite as spicy as the spring break story, but still fun to meet in a foreign country.
Not everyone can claim that. That's cool.
Yeah.
That's great. And then you got married a few years later, I'm assuming.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then what got you into becoming a therapist?
So I hadn't really had an awareness that that could be like a viable career choice. But college, kind of near the end of my college career, my undergraduate, I started going to therapy myself. And I was like, wow, this is really improving the quality of my life. Like there's a lot that I can do here that is helping me suffer a lot less. Even though I was like really embarrassed and ashamed to go, I felt like it meant a lot about me. But then after going through it, I was like, wow, this is incredibly empowering. So I wanted to be able to work in a space like that. And then also, as far as doing, therapy around sexual issues, also during my undergraduate, I had started doing research with some sexuality researchers at BYU that just were so inspiring, amazing mentors. And again, I had this feeling like, wow, this research really matters. Like, this is important. And so being able to combine those two experiences to be able to make a difference in this space that really matters to me felt like an obvious choice.
That's so good. Good. In your therapy practice, is there a common theme that you're starting to pick up on or something that you've become really passionate about through your work working with people?
Yeah, I would say I'm a person that gets excited about a lot of different things, and that probably reflects in my career. In the beginning, it was, sexuality. I was sure that I wanted to only work with sexual related issues. And so I, kind of dove in headfirst in that area. As I started doing more therapy around sexuality, I was working in a sex therapy clinic at the time, and I was noticing in the majority of my sessions, we actually weren't talking about sex. Like what
Right.
we were talking about was the foundation of the relationship. What we were
Hmm.
talking about was the emotional climate, the safety that partners felt with each other, right? This foundation that has to be in place in order to flourish sexually. And of course, knowledge about sexuality and having resources that can support your sexual relationship, that really matters. But if this foundation isn't in place, it's going to feel kind of fragmented, or it's going to feel kind of empty, or something's going to feel off. And so after kind of realizing that, one of the areas that I started to study and really kind of tune into was how couples share power.
Mm.
And I think probably when most listeners hear that word like power, they're like, oh, like it's kind of an intimidating, kind of a confusing topic. No one likes to
Uh-huh.
be told that they have more power than another person.
Uh-huh.
But
Uh-huh.
my hope is that like listeners can listen with a really open heart, knowing that being able to share power more equally, no matter what stage your marriage is in right now, being able to really try to nourish your marriage with more equality is one of the best ways you can support not only your emotional connection, but your sexual connection as well.
Oh, I agree 100%.
Yeah.
So you're interested in power. I don't know if there's like you go to the bookstore and it's like how to share power in your marriage. I don't think it's like said in those ways. But
No.
is there a conversation you had with someone that kind of really like sparked your like kind of put more words or more a better vocabulary to the idea that you're pursuing here?
Yeah. So one story that kind of encapsulates the catalyst to like me wanting to dive in more.
Uh huh.
I was doing therapy with a young married woman. She was younger than me, which I guess I assume like if I'm older than someone, that the person younger than me is going to have more progressive ideas or like isn't going to have experienced the same maybe
Hang-ups.
hangups, yeah,
Yes.
or like
Uh huh.
tradition,
Right. Right. Uh huh.
and false tradition, like tradition that no one really wants to support.
Yeah.
Um, one of those traditions meaning, I think in the past, a husband having the last say or the final say, that's something that was probably much more accepted, 100 years ago than
Right.
it
Uh
is
huh.
now.
Uh huh. Uh
Um,
huh.
and so I was meeting with this young woman and I asked her, she was talking about a situation in her marriage. And I asked her, so tell me a little bit why, in this specific conversation with your husband, why you didn't speak up for your perspective, what mattered to you. She was kind of silencing herself and letting her husband take the lead in this area that she actually had some big feelings about.
Mm-hmm.
And she responded and she said, well, Bonnie, it's because, you know, it goes me and then my husband, then God, like describing this hierarchy of like,
Hierarchy. Uh huh.
yeah, like me and my husband could be equals in some ways, but at the end of the day, my husband has more authority than me. And I just remember sitting in my chair, kind of like frozen, like, whoa, you're younger than me. And you believe that.
Uh-huh.
And it
That's
wasn't
like an
right.
outdated idea. Where'd you get that from?
Well, I mean, I have some good ideas where she could have gotten it from,
I'm
but
being facetious, right? Uh-huh.
yeah, but I want to make a distinction here that my reaction to her wasn't about her wanting a traditional marriage, right?
Mm-hmm.
Meaning maybe a marriage where she stays at home with the children and that her husband's the main breadwinner. Like that's not it was about. And actually, research shows that how we organize our roles doesn't really have to do a ton with power. Like
Right.
we can have very equally shared power in traditional roles, but it was what shocked me or what kind of took me back was kind of the prioritization of need, that she believed that it was the right thing, the healthy thing. This is how to build a healthy marriage, is to make sure that my husband's needs are met before my own always. And
Gotcha.
that, I mean, that is just the perfect recipe for resentment. And so that was like, okay, I need to dig into this. And that's when I started, really paying attention in my therapy sessions. Like, what's going on here? Is this really kind of implicit, this hidden, this subtle belief? How is this creeping in? And not always, women believing that their husbands should have more power, but the other way around too. Like how is power, shifting in these marriages, in these spaces without couples really knowing? Because my guess, and actually a very educated guess, is that most of these processes, these power processes, are really subtle and are really kind of invisible. We're not aware of
Mm.
them. And I think that's why they happen, because I think if we were aware, most people don't want to not share power equally in their marriage. I think in their hearts, I think people do want to share power. I think people
Oh,
want
I
their
see.
spouses to feel like they matter just as much as they matter, right? It is very rare client that's like, no, actually, I want to be more important. Like I matter more than you do.
Uh-huh. Right,
I
right.
really haven't come across that. Yeah.
Okay, great. Maybe
Yeah.
their behavior currently isn't about sharing power, but they want to align and get to a point of
Yeah.
more shared power,
Yeah.
perhaps. And that's why they're in therapy, right? Help us learn these skills to
Yep.
get there.
Totally.
Now, when you talk about sharing power, I
Yeah.
think of like, or let's talk about power that's not shared. I think about like, the tyrant in the home,
Yeah.
like a very explicit. But are there other
Mhm.
ways that some people exert power over their spouse?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think like you said, Dan, most of us, when we think of power, we're thinking like the obvious ways. So saying, explicitly to your partner, what you think doesn't matter, or I'm going to make this decision on my own, or I'm not even going to consult you, or I have the final say. I remember working with a couple who had that understanding that like the husband, because he was the head of the house, had the final say, or that he was the head of the house even, right? Like this idea of there is a hierarchy and I'm at the top. I think most of us think of power and we're like, yeah, that's what power is. But I would say more often than not, power is happening at a more invisible level. And I think how that power might be defined is whose needs and interests and values are built into the relationship, whose needs and goals are taking precedence. It's kind of like the assumption that they will be met. I'm thinking of a client that I worked with who I absolutely loved, and he's actually not with us anymore. It was a really, really sacred experience working with him. Anyway, not going to go into too much detail, but I remember near the end of his life, he kind of woke up to, oh my goodness, I have been making my family structure their lives around what I want. He had a very successful career.
Mm-hmm.
And his assumption was, well, because I'm providing for my family and that's my role, I can kind of do that even if the way I do it makes it so no one else's needs and values can be realized.
Mm.
And he also had a volunteer position that required a lot from him. And it was the same thing. It was, because this is being asked of me, I can do this in a way that I don't need to pay attention to anyone else's needs in the family. And then also I remember, and this is what in one session he told me, he's like, yeah, I get up and I exercise for 2 hours every morning. And I just remember thinking, oh my goodness, like when does your wife have time to do anything for herself, right? Like
Uh-huh.
you get up at the crack of dawn and you're gone, and then you're gone at your job all day, and then you're gone volunteering all night. Your family, right? In a situation like that, a family has to structure itself to accommodate those needs. And when those needs are the only ones being accommodated, no one else gets space for that.
Right.
And I
Yeah.
think that maybe that's a more obvious kind of implicit example of power, is this assumption that I get to set up my life like I like to or like I want to, and then you're going to fit in around me.
Yes. Yes. And that can happen in sex too.
Absolutely.
Like we'll use stereotypes here
Yeah.
where the man's sex, like, or the husband in this case. I'm thinking of a specific couple that I've coached in the past where
Yeah.
his sexual needs kind of were the de facto standard in the marriage. So
Mhm.
the relationship kind of organized around that.
Mhm.
And it wasn't overt,
Yeah.
but it was just kind of covert, just the way things were set up, the way
Mm-hmm.
they operated.
Yeah.
And speaking of stereotypes, what does the research show? Is it sometimes, 50% of the time it's the woman that kind of has more of the power in the relationship, and sometimes the man has more power in the relationship?
Yeah.
Does gender roles kind of matter in this particular area?
Yeah. That's such an amazing question, Dan. And actually, that's something that in my research, like, I've really wanted it to be true that gender didn't matter in power.
Uh-huh. Right,
Like,
right.
I
Uh-huh.
consider myself a very powerful woman,
Uh-huh.
and I know,
Egalitarian, right?
yeah,
Exactly. Uh-huh.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
like, I don't accommodate people just because I'm a girl,
Right.
and I have felt this struggle to try to find research that points to gender doesn't matter in power, but over and over and over again, I come back to that, and it's so disappointing. I'm like, really? So power is just such a huge construct to define, and it's a slippery construct because it can mean, so many different things. It can shift over time. So one of the ways that someone can have more power is financially, right? Like, if I make more money than my husband, you would assume that I have more power in that area. But there's been research that's shown even in couples where the wife, earns more than the husband, that there's still processes that happen where the husband may have more power in that relationship. And I really don't like that research because I'm like, dang it. But I think, maybe a study that kind of sums this up pretty well is from the Gottman lab. And John Gottman, I'm sure you're familiar with him and lots of
Yeah.
your listeners are. Just this incredible researcher. Him and his wife have this incredible marriage lab up at the University of Washington. And they did a longitudinal study over 12 years with 130 couples. I mean, a study of this magnitude is very hard to come by. One of the things that this marriage lab looks at is divorce prediction. Can we look at behaviors in marriage that kind of reliably will predict divorce? And what they found is that men who did not accept influence from their wives, so there's kind of a definition, being open to the influence of your partner. But what they
Great.
found is that the men who didn't accept the influence from their wives, divorce could be predicted with 80% accuracy.
Wow.
In those interactions. And one interesting thing about how this kind of relates to gender is that the opposite wasn't true, because the women were already open to their husband's influence. They were already accepting influence from their husband. I think what that points to is, whether we like it or not, whether I like it or not, there is a gendered aspect to this. I think whether it's nature or nurture, women tend to be a little bit more open to the influence of other people around them. And I think that can be an incredible strength. And I also think that can get in the way sometimes. And what this research also points to for me is that men and women, but especially men, I think need to be really purposeful about, I really need to make sure that I'm making lots of space for my wife and her values and her goals, and not just assuming that mine are automatically going to be met.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Great. I am so interested in learning more how I can be better at sharing power now that we've had this conversation. Any stories you can tell me of people you've worked with where you've witnessed kind of that shift? You told us about that one man who's no longer with us. But like, how about others? Maybe someone that's more subtle, or how they moved into more sharing of power in their relationship.
Yeah. So maybe I'll start with a personal example to,
Great.
start being vulnerable and hopefully relatable. This is a way that me and my, some stories from our marriage. So Dan, have you heard, or any, listeners, if you've heard of the idea of maternal gatekeeping? Has that been something that?
Nope. Let's talk about it.
Okay. So yeah, this is a way that I think a lot of women harness power. And Yes, absolutely.
Before we continue,
Yeah.
we should explain that you can take power in certain aspects of your marriage and not in certain aspects, right? Like in a marriage, a husband might have more power over, let's say, finances, but she might have more power over maternal gatekeeping, or
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
It's not all one and all the other. You can have
No.
the power isn't shared in all areas per se.
Exactly. And it can shift over time. It can shift day by day. It can shift
Uh-huh.
when you go on vacation, right? Like if we're going home, if me and my husband and family are going up to Seattle, where I'm from, for the holidays, all of a sudden, right, we're surrounded by my family, by my friends. I know the streets. I know how to get around. Right. So even like situationally, power can shift. So yeah, definitely. I'm glad that you pointed that out, Dan. So maternal gatekeeping, I'll describe it by this anecdote. So we're getting the kids ready in the morning, and my husband says, "Okay, I'll go get my daughter dressed." And so he goes and gets her ready, and then she comes out, and she's wearing something that I don't like. And so then I step in and I say, "You didn't do that right. I'm going to correct what you did." Right? It's this idea of a woman, a mother, a wife, not allowing her husband to have equal influence in decisions related to the children. So even something as simple as like, hey, we get the kids dressed, he gets the kids dressed, and then I'm like, oh no, that you didn't do it right. And then I go and I redo it. Right. What I'm communicating to my spouse is your idea. Yeah, you're inadequate. Your ideas, your influence here isn't needed. And so I'm going to take this over. And I've seen a lot of like really frustrating patterns for couples in that space. I've had to be really, really purposeful about it and saying, yeah, it doesn't matter. It's okay that his ideas and his vision can prevail in this area. I don't have to veto this, right? It's not fair for me to have veto power, I would say, in any aspect of our relationship. Just like it wouldn't be fair for him to have complete veto power in other areas of our relationship.
Gotcha.
Yeah. This is a story that was told by a client of mine, and they both were able to kind of chuckle at it as like, oh, wow, like we had no idea that this was one way that like this power was unequal. But they had set their marriage up a little bit more traditionally. So she stayed home with the children and loved it. This was not something that she resented, and he worked. And he came home from work one day and came in and said, hey, I'm going to go to this get together with some guys in the neighborhood. And then he left. And I mean, even something as simple as that, right? Like there was this assumption that he could come home and tell the wife without having planned it before, I'm going to go do this, right? I think if we had turned the tables and the wife, right, the wife would have had to, if she were going to do something like that, she'd have to organize a babysitter or make sure that her husband was okay watching the kids and that the dinner was being made. All of these things happening in the background that you have to do to run a household that he just assumed would get done by the wife. And I think that's another subtle way, right? So maybe a more effective or a more equally powered sharing way to do that would be, hey, honey, I really want to go get together with these guys in the neighborhood. What can I do? Is that okay if I do that tonight? Can I take some kids with me? Can we go out to dinner tonight so that, this lightens your load? Coming at it at a little more collaborative way that's attuned to not only his needs, because it's not bad to want to go hang out with friends, right? Like we need social life, but also is taking equally her needs into account. You've been with the kids all day. You've been sick at home, right? Like you're probably tired and you have needs too. Maybe you need a break too. So trying to approach that in a way that's taking both partners' needs into account instead of just assuming you're okay holding the fort down while I go meet my needs, right?
Or you're the de facto babysitter and I can do whatever I want because you'll always watch the kids. How about another example? Maybe something more explicit power grab and maybe the sexual domain?
Yeah, I think, listeners will probably recognize this and be like, oh yes, this is unacceptable. But I remember working with a couple where the husband I'll give two examples. I'll give one where the husband harnessed power or, abused power, and then one where the wife did. But the husband just had these expectations for his wife sexually that just were not fair. He had extremely high standards for her, especially physically. She needed to look a certain way for him to be
You're
able
talking
to
like
basically.
body weight
Mhm.
and appearance, like
Yeah.
hair, clothing. Okay.
Yeah. Especially like body size and shape. And
Mm-hmm.
I remember in a session them telling me that he told her that once she got to a certain weight, once her body had arrived at this place that was acceptable for him, I guess,
Uh-huh.
that they could go on a fancy vacation.
Oh.
And yeah,
Uh-huh.
right. Like your reaction to that is like, ew, right? Like that's
Uh-huh.
so wrong. But
Uh-huh.
right, that's a husband saying, controlling an outcome. It's saying you have to be a certain way before we can have fun together, or before I can accept you. Right. I think that's like a pretty explicit example of power
Yes.
around decision making, around sexuality. Maybe a less explicit example, this time of a woman, I would say, misusing her power is I was working with a couple where the husband really he wanted to feel deeply connected with his wife. But he was, right, his sexual desire and desire to invest and talk about sexuality with his wife, it wasn't coming from a selfish place at all.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he just wanted to nourish and nurture their relationship sexually, which is wonderful. But it was really intimidating for the wife. The conversations that he was wanting to have felt really scary for her. And instead of her owning that and saying, honey, this feels kind of scary, or I'm kind of overwhelmed having these conversations, maybe we can try to get some help to help me not feel so overwhelmed when we have these conversations. Instead of her kind of owning that, she would just
Uh-huh.
shut him down.
Or
And
shame him for being a
yeah,
hedonistic,
exactly, right? Like
right?
I mean,
A
yeah,
sexual
that
person. Uh-huh.
yeah, and it's not because she believed that sex was bad. It was just, emotionally, she
Couldn't
just
handle
felt
it.
really, yeah, she was
So
just
she
really
controlled him
scared.
instead of controlling herself in that moment.
Exactly. Yeah. So we're not going to have this conversation. We're done with this conversation. We're done.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think if
Right.
she was being honest with herself, that was actually coming from a really vulnerable, soft place in her that just wanted to feel safe and secure. But it came out in a very controlling way where the husband felt, like his voice was shut down. There was no room for him to have those conversations. He didn't get to have a choice.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe a way that you can kind of check yourself for like, am I sharing power is, does my partner have a voice? Does my partner have a full voice in this area of our marriage? Right. Because I'm not saying, one of my fears is that listeners will hear this and they'll say, oh, you know what Bonnie's explaining is just so unrealistic. It's just like, when you have a family and you're trying to run a household, it makes no sense to try to have an equal voice on every decision that you have to make. There's just not enough time in the day.
Right. Uh-huh. Let's be
So
realistic.
let's
Uh-huh.
be realistic. Yeah, like that just can't happen. And
Uh-huh.
man, I'm in the thick of that right now, so I can like really connect with that. But I think the distinction here, what I'm trying to explain is whether or not, regardless of how you divide household responsibilities or roles, the key distinction is there a voice? Is there room for you? If something were to matter to you a lot, would your partner, or even to matter to you just a little, would your partner be open?
Mm. Or
And
or do you create and set up hierarchies instead? Right?
yeah,
That's the opposite, right?
exactly. Yeah, I love how you said that, Dan. That's a great way to say that.
That's
Yeah.
good. Okay. So I think awareness and accountability is always the first step. That's the first
Yeah.
rung on the ladder. How
Yeah.
can people listening to this become more aware of, like, holy cow, we do that, or yeah, we do have a hierarchy around that? Like, I can see how people can, like in that example of the husband that needed his wife to lose weight, and if she
Hmm.
did, she would be worthy to go
Yeah.
with him on a fancy vacation, right?
Yeah.
Right. Probably in the middle of it, he doesn't see it that way because he's
Yeah.
kind of self-deceived in it, right? He probably might think, I'm doing my wife a favor here. I'm trying to motivate her to help her with
Yeah.
her weight loss goals. But really, he's wrapped up himself a lot in the way she's looking or not looking. It's really
Mhm.
about him. It's really not about her in that. But he doesn't see it. how can we get better at seeing things that we
Yeah.
might be doing? We might think it's innocent on the outside, but really it's about trying to kind of gain control or kind of do a power grab over our spouse.
Yeah. I mean, I think probably one of the most effective ways to check ourselves is to ask our spouse. and,
Yes.
that, and that might be the most painful or intimidating or scary way. But but I
It's,
remember,
I got to say something about that real quick.
yeah,
My wife went to England this summer on a retreat,
yeah,
and the person leading the retreat, Dr. Jennifer Finlayson-Fife, who's
yeah,
amazing. I love her work.
yeah.
She encouraged all the wives to text her husband, like, what about being married to me is difficult? And that's a tough question to ask, right? It's
Over
like,
text.
well, you're separated from your spouse at the time, but so that was their homework assignment. What is it about
Yeah,
me that's hard to live with? And
yeah.
a lot of them didn't want to hear the answer.
Oh
So
no, yeah. None of us
mhm,
do. None
that's a
of us
tough question
do.
to ask. But usually your spouse has a fairly good idea of when
Absolutely,
they feel like their influence doesn't matter to them, and
totally.
that's what you look for, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe we can kind of soften the blow by just acknowledging the truth that all of us, no matter how hard we work on this, are going to have space to grow, right? So, I mean, I study this a lot. This is what, my whole doctoral research is focused on. And I remember having a conversation just a couple months ago with my husband where he pointed something out and he's like, yeah, Bonnie, you didn't really let me have a voice in that. And I remember feeling kind of crushed, like, oh my
Mm-hmm.
goodness, like
That stings.
it stings. But
uh,
also, if I'm if I'm trying to access the best part of myself, I would never want my husband to feel that way. And
right.
also, that's not the person I want to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we can try to have compassion for ourselves, right? Like I look back to that specific thing that he was talking about. I wasn't trying to be a tyrant. I wasn't trying to be a bulldozer. I was probably trying to like protect myself in a certain way, and make sure that my needs were going to be met. And that matters too. My experience matters too. But I think that there's a way that we can do it that's more conducive to sharing power and allowing mutual influence. So yeah, I would say step one, pray for courage. Try to get to
Mm-hmm.
like a healthy, grounded emotional space, and then ask your spouse, like, hey, what areas, maybe some questions that you could ask are there any areas of our marriage where you wish you had more of a voice? Are there things in our marriage that you feel like I shut down? Do you feel like we have shared responsibility for, X, Y, Z? I think one maybe really specific question that could be asked is, do you feel like we are sharing responsibility for the relationships in our lives? I mean, even with like the holidays coming up, like a really explicit example is like taking responsibility for the relationships during holidays. I mean, think about who normally takes the majority of the mental load and physical load during the holidays. Normally women, right? Women are the one
Yeah. Yes.
organizing schedules. They're the one buying presents, wrapping presents, getting everything ready. And
Right.
I mean, I know personally, I really enjoy that. So that's not something I resent,
Mm-hmm.
but I think that if there's, right, I'm like thinking of like stereotypical situation of like a husband coming to the wife, what are we getting for my parents for Christmas? Like, right. Or like,
Yes,
like opening
exactly.
Christmas presents under the tree. And like the dad is just as surprised as the kid when like the gifts are opened. and we can laugh at this,
Uh-huh.
because,
And
there's
it
kind of
might be
some silliness
fine.
to it
Uh-huh.
and it might be fine. Maybe
Uh-huh.
that's just okay. But also maybe the wife is feeling very burdened, and for a husband to come to her and say, how can I help share the load? How can we spread out the burden that you're experiencing?
Mm-hmm.
Is a way that the husband can say, I want us to feel more like equals in this space. And if the wife is like, no, actually, I really enjoy this. I got this. Go do your thing. That's fine, right? There's not one right way to do this. The
Mm-hmm.
right way to do this depends on, are we taking responsibility? Are we sharing responsibility equally in the ways that matter to us? Are we open to each other's influence? If I ask for help with something, if I ask to have a conversation about something, are you open to it, or are you shutting me down? right? These are the things
Mm-hmm.
that I think really are the subtle ways that power becomes unequal in marriage.
I like that.
Yeah.
That's really good.
Yeah.
And that reminds me, a while ago, I read the book Fair Play. I forgot the
Yeah.
name of the author.
Uh-huh.
It's about sharing the mental load.
Yeah.
And having those conversations with my wife have really helped us kind of air that out. And may I add, another thing to help you with your awareness is if there's an aspect of your relationship where you're starting to feel resentful, that's like the canary in the coal mine.
Absolutely.
It's the yellow flag or the red flag that something is off. And it could be that you're resentful because you need to grow up and like start pulling your weight more.
Yeah.
Or it could be you're resentful because you're blaming others for your choices. Like, I don't like that they do this, or I don't like that I have to do this. So paying attention to where there is resentment will probably help you address the areas of the relationship where you can share the power better.
Yeah, absolutely. A little anecdote to illustrate that. So my husband has a full-time job. He's a marketer for a tech company, but he also loves acting. He's kind of a hobby actor, and he's in a show right now. And opening night is actually tonight. I'm going to go
Oh, that's
watch
exciting.
him. I know. But so he's been really busy with rehearsals, as he should be. And I have been trying to be really honest with myself, like, is it okay with our family right now and how crazy things are for him to do this show and how much he's going to be gone from home? And in my heart, I just feel like, yes, absolutely. Like it makes him so happy. It's so fun. It's this awesome creative outlet. But he came home the other day after it was on a Saturday, after rehearsal, and I noticed some resentment in me. I was like, he walks through the door. He like came in, he said hi, and then he walked right back out because he's trying to do some home projects. And I noticed like this bubble inside of me. I was like, oh, like, what is this? Like, this doesn't feel good. And then I asked myself, is it because I'm resentful about the play? And it's not. Like, I truly love that he does the play. And I realized, oh, it's because like he didn't make time like for our relationship to reconnect. Like, I just needed him to come in and to like sit with me for a second, to like regroup, to say, you matter to me, you know, I love you, I see you, what do you need? How can we navigate the rest of this day together? Kind of this attunement to the relationship. Maybe one kind of power-oriented way of describing it is taking responsibility for the health of our relationship during that day instead of just focusing on his project.
So then what did you do?
Yeah, so I was very proud of myself. I forget when it happened. I think it was that night, or anyway, at some point during the day when it was just me and him and the kids weren't like trying to climb all over us. I was like, you know, Sam, it's not that I'm resenting that you're in the play. It's not that I don't want you to do things that you enjoy. And it's not that I don't want you to do projects around the house, because goodness knows I cannot do them right now. With everything else I have going on and I'm pregnant, like I just can't do those. And I said, I think it's that I feel like the weight of the responsibility of making sure that our relationship is staying connected, that we're attuning to each other. I feel like that's falling on me right now. And he was so responsive. He's like, Bonnie, thank you so much for telling me. I don't want to be that way. You matter to me. Let's do better. I'll do better. Right. So I think that's just an anecdote of me recognizing some resentment in me and then acting from a place of strength. I mean, I have plenty of examples of me not acting from a place of strength.
But that was a good day. But
this is a good day.
I love that because you didn't try to get him back or get revenge.
No,
right? In a very covert way.
Yeah.
No, you address the conflict in a very healthy way, right?
Yeah.
That's so good. So good. But when I read the book Fair Play, one of the big ahas for me was I used to, and this was invisible to me, right?
Yeah.
Like in my own marriage, I would think I had a bigger voice because my wife stays home with the kids and I work and I bring in the income. I do a lot of the shopping. But once I realized that it's not that I'm worth more dollar per hour than her, it's a unit of my time is an equal of a unit of her time. Once I really got that settled in, it changed everything. Yeah. It's not that a unit of my time is more valuable than a unit of her time. I used to think that, like, oh, I can't go run this errand because I'm at work. You should go run this errand because, you know, that as if I'm delegating it to an assistant or someone lesser. That's the way I would treat my wife. But once I got it in my head that a unit of her time is just as valuable as a unit of my time, the work that she is doing is just as valuable as the work I'm doing. I used to view my work as more valuable than her, so I'd treat her as if like she can do these little things and I'll handle the big things, kind of.
Yeah.
And then that changed everything. And also just realizing if we were to divorce, not that we're planning on it, they'd take our assets, split them half would be hers, half would be mine. So in other words, every dollar, quote unquote, I'm earning is actually a dollar she's earning too, because there would be no way I'd be able to do what I do if she didn't do what she did. So our roles are complementary, right?
Yeah.
So she's actually earning, however much dollars an hour being a stay-at-home mom, so to speak, as I am doing what I do to bring in money. So once I really got in my head that, no, we're equal in our efforts, even though our roles are different, it changed our relationship.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. And I feel like maybe one of the unintended consequences of the sexual revolution and the feminist revolution, I guess there's been different waves of feminism, but maybe some of the more recent waves of feminism has been kind of a devaluing of work in the home, which I think has led to this assumption that work at home, homemaking, raising babies isn't as important as work that can be reflected by a salary or a wage. And I just think that's a really shaky foundation to try to build equality, to build a society or to build equality, right? And again, I think that the world needs all types of relationship configurations, whether that's both parents staying out, there's not one right way. You have to figure out what works for your marriage. But the foundation always needs to be equality, regardless of what you choose to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. All right. As we conclude, this is a podcast dedicated to helping couples have a better sex life. That's a big running theme. And it's so important that couples learn how to share power. And I loved your example of being able to speak up directly to your husband, say, this is kind of what's needed here. Is there a last story or last experience you can close with about maybe someone you worked with that was really trying hard to grow the sexual relationship in the marriage, but it backfired because the power wasn't shared right? So we can kind of tease that out so we can finally illustrate what to do better in situations like that.
Yeah, two quick anecdotes. So I'm thinking of a client that I worked with who just really wanted to improve his sexual relationship. And so, he kind of went to maybe like the things that he assumed that would help first. So things like he bought things, he bought a massage table, he bought, toys and lingerie and when
Is
he
this
brought
me, by the way? Just kidding. Me a few years ago.
Yeah, I think that this can probably feel relatable to a lot of us. Like things will help, our
Elaborate
relationship.
date nights,
Yes,
getaways, toys,
yes,
different
like
kinds of lube.
yeah, or we just need novelty, or we just need something different, right? But and he was just perplexed that he's like, well, I bought all these things and I've done all these things and still nothing is changing. And or maybe they would change really momentarily while something was still new and novel, but then it would kind of go back to the baseline. And I think it's because the foundation, kind of like we were talking about at the beginning, the foundation of the relationship of mutual respect, of shared power, of being open to each other's influence, just wasn't there. He didn't really know how to share power with his wife. He would ignore her when she brought things up that she needed in the relationship. He would interrupt her when they would have family discussions. If she brought up topics that were intimidating to him, or that maybe showed that she knew more about something than him, he would like shut her down. Right. He just felt I think some of his insecurities made it so that she couldn't feel like she was fully an equal, and he didn't treat her as an equal. And when she would try to defend what she needed, he would, dig his heels in even more. And so it's like, yeah, if that is the foundation, if those are the patterns that are happening in your marriage, trying to buy a toy is putting lipstick on a pig,
Yes.
Like there's just, right. The healthiest sexual relationships, I think, are ones that just kind of bloom and grow naturally out of this deep, soulful connection and respect. And then if you have that, I think that's when it's like appropriate and probably really helpful to add novelty or to add these other things. But if your partner is feeling like they don't matter, it's going to be really hard to make that sexual relationship feel fulfilling and connected.
Yes. You said you might have another?
So yeah, this is one where I think maybe could also feel really relatable to listeners. I know it feels relatable for me. But there was a couple I worked with where the husband would become really dysregulated in his marriage, like whether it was because of a difficult day at work or stuff with his family, or just personally, things within himself, frustrations with himself. He would just become kind of grumpy. And when that would happen, the wife would feel really scared. Like, instead of being able to say, that's him, he owns him, it's not my job to like cheer him up, right? She kind of leaned into, I have to roll out the red carpet when he comes home to make sure that my job is to keep people happy, which I would say is a maybe stereotypically female thing to do, is, accommodate and to try to like set everyone else up for success so that no one has to be uncomfortable.
Right.
And one of the ways that she did this, one of the ways that she accommodated was through sex. She knew, like, okay, if my husband is grumpy, I know that I can feel maybe not all the way connected, but maybe a little bit more connected with him if I like initiate sex. And so she would start using sex to try to get that connection that she was craving. And he would respond
by getting grumpier because he got more sex. Just kidding.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think if we're looking long term, we're looking long term, it wasn't improving the grumpiness.
Grumpy, we have really hot sex. There's a connection here.
Yeah, the classical conditioning. But right, if you're using sex like that,
sex was a bargaining chip in their marriage.
Yeah.
It was
a bargaining chip. It was used to try to control a mood. And it was used to try to get something from her husband. She was craving that connection, and it's not bad to crave connection. Of course, she's going to feel uncomfortable when her husband's like grumpy and totally unaware of her. That's absolutely normal. But I think that there's a healthy way to go about that shares and honors power in a more respectful way versus trying to use sex as a tool to try to gain more power or to try to control behavior. So yeah, when power is not equally shared, I think it can just really pervert even the most, genuine, heartfelt desires to feel connected or healthy expressions of sexuality. So I think we have to be really purposeful. Like, am I using sex to try to control my spouse's behavior? Whether that's in a way where I'm trying to get something from him or I'm trying to keep him at bay or her at, in my opinion, what it should be, which is a celebration of the beautiful connection and love that we have together and a place to celebrate our relationship rather than to try to control or manipulate the partner.
Yeah, definitely. If you stay in it, I think you'll resent the sex. Absolutely. Sexual desire will go away because it now has become a job. It's work instead of play. Like it really will erode the foundation of the relationship when you keep it in that frame.
Exactly.
Bonnie, this has been such an amazing conversation. You're so insightful and experienced, and you're brilliant. I love that you're doing this research too. If people want to learn more about what you do, what's a great way for them to find you?
Yeah, so I do have an Instagram. It's just Bonnie Young, but more reliably, you can find me at bonnieyoungcounseling.com. That's where I have a little bit more about myself, what I do professionally. I wrote a book. You can find my book there as well. And then also my husband and I have a therapy clinic called Azure Counseling, Azure, like the color, azurecounseling.com as well.
Very good. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you're interested in accelerating growth in your marriage, either sexually, emotionally, or spiritually, I want to invite you to work with me in my affordable coaching program called Next Level. More information about Next Level and my fun and sexy apps for couples are available at getyourmarriageon.com. Please also don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss a single episode. And be sure to tell your married friends. I promise, they will thank you for life. Now go get your marriage on.